Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Samach Aleph finishes off Perek Kesad Me'avrin, the fifth Perek of Masechta Shabbos, and begins the sixth Perek of Masechta Shabbos. It also contains one Mishnah besides for that. So from the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnah, we are busy discussing situations in which you have a city completely within the tchum of another city. Now we had seen the halacha that as long as the city is completely within the tchum, it doesn't count as part of the 2,000 amos of that tchum at all. You skip the city completely when measuring those 2,000 amos. If, however, the tchum ends within this city, then the entire part that's within the city does count, and the line is drawn right to the city. We had seen that that statement was said by Rabbi Shua ben Levi. We had seen that the Gemara challenged that. The Gemara wasn't happy with that. Rabbi Edi was upset about it. He said it's divrei nevius. The Gemara has now brought a Mishnah which seems to say exactly that halacha, and then the Gemara is going to be explaining why it does not say that halacha and why some say that it does, some say that it does not. And from there, we're going to move on to some other halachas about cities with borders and how you calculate their tchumen. We're going to discuss if there's a steep drop outside the city, and the fear makes it not considered to be a city at all. And two other cities that were on a slope and seem to get into fights with each other all the time. Then we'll get actually to the next Mishnah, which is this exact Mishnah which we will be analyzing before then. And then we will be able to see that Mishnah more deeply involved. So let's see the Gemara here. The Gemara again says that this halacha of Rabbi Shua ben Levi doesn't seem to make sense. Why should you count a city that falls within another tchum only if the tchum ends in the middle of the city, and if the entire city is within the tchum, it does not count? It shouldn't make any sense. And the Gemara quotes the Mishnah, which is coming up soon. Rava brings it. And the Mishnah says as follows. If it says you have a large city next to a big city, so the people from the let me restate that. You have a small city next to a large city. So the people from the big city are allowed to carry in the small city. People from the small city are not allowed to carry in the big city. That is Rava's girsa, at least. Rava says, how does this make any sense? Why should the people from the big city be allowed to carry in the small city, and people in the small city not be allowed to carry, or not even carry, be allowed to walk into the big city? If the reason is that the small city is within the tchum of the big city and the big city is not within the tchum of the small city, that would not be a chiddush. That would not make any sense. Obviously, it's not true. What then is a chiddush? So he says it must be that the small city is completely within the tchum of the big city, while the big city has the tchum of the small city end within it. And what it's teaching us here is the exact halach of Rabbi Shua ben Levi. The small city is completely within the tchum of the big city, and therefore it doesn't count at all towards the measuring of the tchum. You skip right over it when you're measuring the tchum. Otherwise, it wouldn't be any chiddush if it's completely within the tchum that you're allowed to walk there. The big city, however, does not fit completely within the tchum, and therefore you do count it. And this is exactly the halach of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, and that's how you have to understand it. So the Gemara says, then, what is Ravidi going to do with this? Why does he say that there is no source to this halacha? The Gemara says Ravidi has a different gear, so he says that both people of both cities are allowed to carry from one city to the other city. There is no difference between the two. They're both allowed to carry. And the reason is that they've set up an Eruv Tchumen in the other city. People from each city has set up an Eruv Tchumen in the other city. And that Eruv makes the other city their tchum, and therefore they're allowed to consider that entire city to be like their 4 amos. That is the chiddush of this Mishnah. Ravidi says, however, the Mishnah doesn't say anything about somebody who's actually making his own Eruv, his own city is the center of his tchum. He doesn't have an Eruv, and he's measuring to the neighboring city. Doesn't talk about that case at all. So the Gemara says, but it does talk about the case. If you look further in the Mishnah, it talks about the case, and it says that if your tchum ends actually right in the middle of a cave, you only get half the cave. You don't get the other side of the line. So you see, it explicitly says that halacha, and that actually was one of Rabbi Shua ben Levi's halacha, so it clearly says this halacha, that if the tchum ends in the city, you do have to count the city. So Gemara says, as a matter of fact, why does Rabbi Shua ben Levi have to teach me this halacha if it's explicit in the Mishnah? The Gemara says, okay, that's already not a problem. Rabbi Shua ben Levi's chiddush was the other side. He was saying that if the entire city fits within the tchum, you don't have to count any of it. Now, so we have the two girsais here. Do we say that the two people from each city are both allowed to walk into the neighboring city, or do we say that only the small city is not allowed to walk into the big city? The big city is allowed to walk to the small city. So Gemara says neither of them are wrong. They both fit, and they have a slightly different gerses in the Mishnah. One of them says that they're both allowed to go, and it's referring to moving their Erev. The other one is understanding that the people from the small city are not allowed to walk into the big city. They will have to insert a phrase into the Mishnah, because the Mishnah does clearly say later that we're talking about setting up Eruvin. We'll have to insert a phrase that this is true when you're measuring, but when you're setting up an Erev, then you would be allowed to go from city to city just to make things fit. Okay, now the Gemara discusses another halacha, and this is talking about where you have a steep drop outside a city. So Rav Yosef says in the name of Rami Bar Abba, name of Rav Huna, if you have a city that's on the bank of a river and there's a steep drop down to the river, so if you have a security wall, the Gemara calls a thin fence, which is 4 amos tall. So if you have that, then the city counts as a city, and you would measure its tchum from the border, and the border would be that wall. If, however, the city doesn't have any security fence, and people are afraid to walk around there because of the fear that they'll fall off the edge, so it doesn't count as a city at all. There is no borders to the city. It's counted as just individual houses, and each person has to measure a 2,000 amot chum from his own individual house. So Gemara asks, first of all, why does the wall have to be 4 amos high? Usually these walls have to be only 4 tfachim high. We said whenever we say to make a thin wall, it's usually just 4 tfachim. Gemara says here it's different because it has to be for security. It has to make you not feel like you're about to fall. So it has to be safe. It has to be a big enough wall. So now the Gemara says, where is the source of this halacha? That if there's a steep drop, that it cancels the status of the city. So the Gemara brings the case, and the Gemara says, this is obviously the pshat in the case, and then the Gemara offers 3 alternative pshatim in the case, which would therefore not be the source of this. The case is, there was a city called Chamsan and a city called Geder, and Chamsan and Geder were both on a steeply sloping mountain. Chamsan was lower on the mountain, Geder was higher on the mountain, and Rebbe said the following halacha. He said that the people of Geder are allowed to go downhill to Chamsan. The people of Chamsan are not allowed to go up the hill to the Geder city. And the Gemara says, why not? The Gemara says, it must be that there was a steep slope, and therefore people were afraid of falling. And the Geder people went ahead and made a security wall, and therefore their entire city was considered to be 1 tchum, and they were allowed to measure 2,000 amos from the edge of the tchum. And those 2,000 amos included Chamsan, and therefore they were allowed to go to Chamsan. However, Chamsan didn't make a security wall, and therefore they didn't have the status of a city, and therefore each individual could only measure 2,000 amos from his house. Some of them were within 2,000 amos of Geder, and some of them were not, and therefore those people who were not able to go into the Geder area because of that. So the Gemara says this would be the source then of the halacha, that if you don't have a security wall, it doesn't count as a city at all. So the Gemara says not necessarily true, because there are other ways to understand this. First of all, one way to understand it is that the Geder people were violent and dangerous people, and they used to come and hit and beat up the Chamsan people, and therefore Rebbe said that they shouldn't go from Chamsan to Geder, because if the Chamsan people go to Geder, they're going to get beaten up. There's going to be fighting, especially on Shabbos when there was a lot of alcohol flowing freely, and therefore you don't want Chamsan people traveling to Geder on Shabbos. You could, however, have Geder people travel to Chamsan because when you're not in your own city, you're not so confident, and therefore they wouldn't start a fight being away from home. The Gemara asks, but they might get beaten up themselves by the Chamsan people. And the Gemara says, no, the Chamsan people weren't that violent. They weren't going to beat up the Geder people even if they came to them. Now, Rav Safra here gives a different shot on why Rebbe did not allow the people from Chamsan to go to Geder, only vice versa. He says that actually Chamsan was a city which was shaped like a archway, with the arch opening facing towards Geder. And we had seen this halacha before, that if the space between the legs of the arch is greater than 4,000 amos, which it was here, so you have to measure the tchum from the actual houses. You can't measure it from the line that runs between the legs of the arch, and therefore the people at the top of the arch were too far. They were outside of 2,000 amos of getting to Geder, and therefore they weren't allowed to go. The ones in the legs were able to go. Now, you could ask over here that the people that are on the top of the arch could go through the legs to get to Chamsan. It could be that Rebbe made that to get to Gader. It could be that Rebbe made that forbidden because he was afraid that people would make mistakes. Rav Dimi Bechina gives another pshat here. He just says very simply that Chamson was a small city and therefore was within the tchum of Gader, while Gader itself was a big city and it was not within the tchum of Chamson, and that's why he couldn't go to all of it. The Gemara quotes that Rav Kahana had a different version as to who said what. Between Rav Safra and Rav Dimi Bar Chanina, he wasn't sure which one said which. He just said he had the two names, he had the two quotes, he wasn't sure which one was which. This is the Gemara. Now we get to our next and final Mishnah in Perek Ketzad Me'avrin. The Gemara now quotes the actual Mishnah, which we've been discussing all this time. This is the last Mishnah in the Perek, and the Mishnah says as follows. Our girsa of the Mishnah is the one which we'd seen earlier, in which both cases the people have the full range. We have that it's mutter, both the people of the big city and of the small city, to go the full area. We don't have that there's anything which is forbidden. And this is what the Mishnah says. It says if you have two cities, one big, one small, and you placed an Eruv, actually, that's our girsa, one of the cities placed an Eruv in the other city, so it gets the entire city, and then 2,000 amas outside the city itself. That's where you set up your Eruv. Rabbi Kiva disagrees. Rabbi Kiva says, no, you only get 2,000 amas from the Eruv. You don't get 2,000 amas from the city, just the Eruv. Any Eruv which is not your actual place where you physically are present, there is no halacha that you get the entire city and then the 2,000 amas begin outside the city. So Rabbi Kiva said to them, to the Chachamim who said that you do, he said, wouldn't you agree that if you have your Eruv in a cave, you just get 2,000 amas from the Eruv, you don't get the entire cave? And he said, yes, that's true if nobody lives in the cave. If, however, the cave is a city because people live in it, then you would get 2,000 amas from the cave. And interestingly, they say, therefore it comes out that in the cave would have different halacha than above the cave. If you're on the ground just above the cave, there's no residence there. You would only get 2,000 amas from the actual Eruv, or the 4 amas of the Eruv. If you're in the cave and there are people who live in it, then you get the entire cave and 2,000 amas past that. Now, if somebody's measuring his tchum and it ends in the middle of the cave, then even the Chachamim agree that you only get up until the line. You do not get the rest of the cave. Gemara now brings the Machlekes Hamoraim. What would the Chachamim say in a city which is abandoned? That's the entire city is still standing, but nobody lives there anymore. It's completely abandoned. So according to Yehuda Amar Shmuel, the Chachamim would agree that if you set up an Eruv there, you only get 2,000 amas from the Eruv itself. They would say here, we agree to Rabbi Akiva, that you do not get the entire city, because the city is empty. And therefore, even though it's physically still standing, it has no halacha of a city. You only get 2,000 amas from your Eruv itself. Now, Rabbi Elazar says, no, the Chachamim here would still say the same shita. Just like they say you get 2,000 amas beginning from the edges of a city, the same thing would apply even if the city was abandoned. So Gemara says, how could Rabbi Elazar say that's what the Chachamim would hold? The Mishnah clearly said that Rabbi Akiva's taina to the Chachamim was, shouldn't you agree that in a cave you only get 2,000 amas from your Eruv? And they said, that's true unless there are people that are living there. So obviously that the halacha is based on whether people are living there or not. As long as people are living there, the Chachamim would say that you get 2,000 amas from the edges of the city, not from the Eruv. But if there's no people living there, meaning it's abandoned, just like that abandoned city, you would not get 2,000 amas from the edge of the city. You would get 2,000 amas from your Eruv. So how could Rabbi Eliezer say differently? So Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer will tell you when it says nobody lives in the cave, it doesn't mean that nobody happens to be living in the cave. It means that it's inhospitable. It's inhabitable. There is no way to live there. The wall fell down. It's blocked. Whatever it is, you cannot live there. A place which you cannot live, that's different. But an abandoned city that nobody lives in is still called a city. Gemara now tries to bring a raya to Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel's opinion, who holds that even in a city which is completely abandoned, the Chachamim would agree, specifically in a city which is abandoned, the Chachamim would agree that you only get 2,000 amas from the Eruv and not 2,000 amas from the edges of the city. In order to do that, we bring this brisa. We're going to have to establish a few things about the brisa. The brisa says that if somebody has an Eruv in a city which is as great as Antioch, or in a cave which is as big as that of Tzidkiyahu Melech Yehuda, who was escaping and he hid in a cave, either way, if he spent Shabbos in these places, the brisa says, it doesn't say he left an Eruv. He spent Shabbos in these places. In either of these two, he would get 2,000 amas from the edges of the cave or the edges of the city. So the Gemara first of all makes the diak and says that we obviously are referring to places that are abandoned because we said a cave and a city together. So obviously the cave and the city are the same, just like the cave is empty of inhabitants, the city is also empty of inhabitants. So that's proof. That's step one. So it's an abandoned thing. Step two is that only if you're actually spending Shabbos there do you get 2,000 amas from the edges. But if you're just leaving an Eruv there, you would only get 2,000 amas from your actual Eruv. That's a diak. And then step three is that this can't be Rabbi Akiva, it has to be the Chachamim. How do you know it can't be Rabbi Akiva? Because according to Rabbi Akiva, no matter where you leave your Eruv, you only get 2,000 amas from the Eruv. It wouldn't be a Chiddush that because it's abandoned or because it's a cave or whatever it is, you always only get 2,000 amas from the actual Eruv. So therefore, you see this price is obviously the Chachamim, and it's saying that it's an abandoned place, and you get 2,000 amas from the Eruv if you left an Eruv, and you only get 2,000 amas from the entire edges of the area if you actually spent Shabbos there. So that proves Rabbi Yehuda Mashmuel's opinion. So the Gemara says not necessarily. Could actually be that this place was not abandoned at all. As a matter of fact, it's fully inhabited. And you're right, both the cave and the city are similar. They're similar and both are inhabited. It's not that the city is like the cave and uninhabited. The cave is like the city that it is inhabited. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Well, but it said the cave is like the cave of Tzidkiyahu Melech Yehuda. That was an abandoned, uninhabited cave. How can you tell me this is an inhabited cave? So Gemara says, no. It was only like the cave of Tzidkiyahu in size. It was not like the cave of Tzidkiyahu in the fact that it's uninhabited. It's that big, but it is inhabited. And therefore, this entire brisa is talking about being inhabited. It's an inhabited cave. And the reason why you only get 2,000 amas from the actual Eruv, if you left an Eruv, as opposed to actually spending Shabbos there, is because this entire brisa is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who holds that an Eruv always only gives you 2,000 amas, doesn't give you the edges of the city itself. Now the Gemara finishes off the parak with one incident. Gemara says that Mar Yehuda found the people of the city of Mavrachta who left an Eruv in a very big shul in a place called Oigav Agoivar. And he said to them, move your Eruv, leave it in the edge of the shul so that you'll get more of a space. It was a very big shul, and they just left it randomly wherever they had a spot. So he said, you want it to be all the way on the edge of the shul so you get more ability to walk further based on this Eruv. So the Gemara says that Rava said to him, what are you talking about? Don't you know that the Chachamim hold you get the entire area, you get the entire width of the shul, you get the entire enclosed area. The shul was not inside the city, it was outside, but they would have the entire shul. You would only count 2,000 amas from the edges of the shul property. It shouldn't make a difference where in the shul it is. Obviously, you are arguing on the Chachamim and you're passing like Rabbi Akiva. Don't you know that the halacha never follows Rabbi Akiva and his own shitos in Hilchos Eruvin? That takes us to the end of the parak, and now we begin the sixth parak. The sixth parak, called Hadar Ma'akam, discusses the halachos of Erev Chatzeres and Shutufim Avois. And this will be the topic for the next four prakim altogether. Specifically, the first Mishnah begins by discussing the concept of somebody who is together with you in your chutzner. He lives in the chutzner together with you. He has his own house there, but he does not agree with the chutzner. He does not want to be counted as part of the chutzner. He doesn't join the Eruv Chatzeres that you would like to make. So as we have seen, he makes it forbidden for everybody to carry. The point of an Eruv Chatzeres is that everybody who lives and has access to use this chutzner joins in one conglomerate. If one person is out, so then the entire thing is off. So Gemara says, as we shall see, if one of them is a goy, there's a different problem. The goy doesn't have to join the Eruv. He does have to allow you to rent his reshus from him. That's not because he has anything to do with the halachos of Eruvin. It's just because Chazal made exer. They didn't want Jews living in the same chutzner as a goy altogether. So they said you have to rent reshus. You have to rent rights to use his house, and he's probably not going to allow that. So Jews will have to move out. If the other person is a Jew and he didn't make an Eruv, he didn't join the Eruv, he could do what's called Bittul Rishos. He could relinquish his rights to use the chutzner. By doing that, he's out of the chutzner, doesn't have rights to use it. He's not part of the conglomerate, but he's also not another right in the chutzner besides the conglomerate, and therefore he is not going to be a problem. So the Mishnah begins and it says somebody who has a goy living in the same chutzner as him, or somebody that does not agree with the Eruv, that cancels the Eruv. You cannot use the chutzner. Now, the Tanakama holds that's even if there's only one Jew in the chutzner, you have to make an Eruv with him, and he's not agreeing to your Eruv. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says no, it's only if you have need for an Eruv. If there's only one Jew in the chutzner, there's no problem. If you have two Jews there, then they need to make an Eruv between them, so the existence of a third Jew who doesn't agree, or of a guy, cancels the Eruv and it's no good. Now, Rav Gamliel has an incident. It was a Tzeduki that did not hold of the halachos of Eruvin, and he lived together with him and his sons and his family in a chutzner, and he had apparently given them bittul rishos. He said, okay, I'm going to cancel my rights to use the chutzner, but Rav Gamliel was afraid he was going to change his mind. Now, he did not have the halachic status of a goy, or he wouldn't be able to change his mind. Once you rent out the rights to use your house, you can't just change your mind. But as a Jew, which is what his halacha was, he could just say, I'm not agreeing with my bittul rishos, I'm going to start using this chutzner again. So he said to his family, according to one version, he said, make sure you start using the chutzner first, so that you take the right for him to change his mind away from him, or do whatever you need to do now, because he's about to change his mind, and once he changes his mind, he won't be able to use the chutzner anymore. That concludes.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.